United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaks at the Munich Security Conference, the measure of mediocrity. The 60th Annual Munich Security Conference is convening from February 16th to the 18th in Munich, Germany. The Davos of Defense has about 60 heads of states and officials from over 85 countries attending, along with other experts, to discuss global security issues ranging from global conflict and terrorism, supply chains, unregulated artificial intelligence, economics, climate, but the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine are expected to dominate the agenda. One of the panel discussions at the conference is about global order and is headlined by United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, with a 15-minute address on the opening day. Secretary General Guterres' speech is summarized as a jumbled confusion calling for a world order that needs to serve everyone while taking no responsibility for the failures of its own organization in the current security environment. Guterres starts his address that the world order is not working for anyone, with the world more divided now than the past 75 years. He states the current multipolar world is more dangerous than the bipolar world of the Cold War that faced an existential threat of nuclear war, but the new multipolar world still has the existential threat of nuclear war. He then adds unregulated artificial intelligence and the climate crisis as existential threats as well. This sounded like a checkbox to satisfy climate activists and throwing the AI buzzword in for good measure. Guterres brings up the existential threats to the globe and states that multipolar world creates more opportunities for, quote, balance and justice, end quote, and new global leadership, but this multipolar world needs strong global institutions to prevent chaos. Since Guterres is the Secretary General of the United Nations, it is naturally assumed that he is promoting the cause of the UN to bring order to the world. He states that the competition between countries is being prioritized over cooperation, and this is what is creating the crisis seen throughout the world. Guterres states that countries are acting out of impunity with no threat of accountability, and that the rule of law needs to be followed throughout the world to end this behavior and the crisis created by competition. What Guterres leaves out is the utter failure of the United Nations to even advance these goals in any meaningful way, and instead relies on the organizations acting outside of the UN to attain goals because the organization is utterly incompetent and paralyzed to advance any of Guterres' suggestions. The UN in general, and Guterres in particular, have not prescribed any solutions or even taken diplomatic actions to bring about the end of the war in Ukraine. If he believes that Russian action was out of impunity and no accountability, as he stated is the problem, why has he not used his personal clout to press the parties to come to the peace table? Yes, the UN is near powerless to advance actions on its own without consent of the UN Security Council. But that does not mean that he cannot make a public campaign to find a way forward to end the war. Former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was on a personal mission to negotiate a ceasefire in the Congo when he was killed in a plane crash. The cause of the crash was unclear. Hammarskjöld was using his prestige as the Secretary General to bring peace without the mandate from the Security Council. Secretary General has taken no such action to back his vision with action. Guterres has also pressed for reforms to the Security Council through either rotation of veto powers among countries instead of the current 5 permanent members, or replacing individual countries with multinational organizations such as the European Union or the Organization of American States, and give them veto power along with increasing the executive authority of the Secretary General. Whether these ideas are good or bad in an organization as broken as the UN, he could use gridlock in the Security Council over the Ukraine war as a backdrop to reinforce his reform ideas, but again, no action from Guterres. Guterres in his speech says that the humanitarian efforts in Gaza are on, quote, life support, end quote, and that the war itself is proof that the global order is not working. However, just like the war in Ukraine, he takes none of the personal or professional sacrifice to use his position to advance addressing what he thinks are the inequities, and instead relies on the U.S. and other regional powers to find a resolution to the conflict. He laments the humanitarian plight of the Gazans in Rafah, but takes no responsibility for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees had for Hamas tunnels housing Hamas fighters and supplies under their headquarters in Gaza City, and that at least 12 of its UN workers participated in the October 7th attacks on Israel. Secretary Guterres states that the rule of law needs to be followed in his speech, but he is vague on what that means. It is assumed that he wants a rule-based order of the world with all countries following the same rules and held accountable for those rules. This is another example of rhetoric versus actions. The United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas has ruled that China on its expansive sovereignty claims over the South China Sea, but has not deterred China in its claims and dismissing jurisdiction of the UN to rule over the matter. Guterres has not called out China in ignoring of the UN and has not used it as an example in an argument for his vision of needed Security Council reforms. Again, China is a permanent member of the Security Council. Related to the rule of law and those rules of law that is being promoted, Guterres has called on tech companies to do what he believes is their part not to profit from, quote, toxic content of all kinds, end quote, which is causing divisions in the multipolar world. He stated that social cohesion needs to be emphasized based on, quote, justice and inclusion that is anchored on human rights, end quote. This appears to be an emphasis on Chinese-style speech and content codes and away from the U.S. version of freedom of speech and promotion of the marketplace of free thought and ideas. Guterres' vision is for rules to be established on what speech is allowed and not allowed, but is unclear who gets to determine those rules. He talks of multipolar world that will have different cultures and norms, but some type of speech rules is to be created to serve and enforce in that multipolar environment. What kind of speech code can meet his objective across so many cultures? The position of Secretary General is a compromise role and must be acceptable to both sides of the bipolar world content of the current UN Security Council. Therefore, bold action is not part of the job that will make the Secretary to be embraced by the permanent members of the Security Council. That being said, Secretary Guterres has shown himself to be nothing more than a bloviating mouthpiece who lacks the courage and accountability to turn his high-minded rhetoric into some form of action. Guterres needs to show some inclination and courage to use his platform to advance his vision. But thankfully, for the more freedom-oriented and those who believe in the ideals of liberty, the current UN Secretary General is a byproduct of fear and mediocrity that will thankfully make him nothing more than a footnote.